The apartheid regime of South Africa was known for many atrocities and crimes against humanity, such as institutionalizing and legalizing a brutal regime of racial segregation that oppressed millions of people classified by the regime as non-white, by restricting their movement and denying them access to education or even passports or actual citizenship. From the birth of the regime in 1948 to its downfall in 1994, there was fierce resistance coming mostly from those the regime classified as black, who made up the majority of the population. However, some of the lesser-known nefarious activities of the apartheid regime were their twisted attempts to innovate within the realm of science and technology, with the sole intent of coming up with novel ways to control and oppress non-whites, or anyone in general who resisted the regime. From attempting to create a wolf-dog hybrid, to developing a bomb that would only kill people of a particular ethnicity, to trying to change the sexual orientation of homosexual peoples through the use of electrical shocks, their scientific adventures ranged from the bizarre to the outright grotesque. During the 1980s, the apartheid regime attempted to breed a super dog that would be able to track and chase guerrillas fighting the government. The guerrillas used amphetamines to enable themselves to run for long periods from government forces. Many dogs used by the regime would succumb to exhaustion while trying to pursue these guerrillas. The authorities turned to the military-affiliated and Pretoria-based Rudaplat breeding enterprises to develop a countermeasure. This entity was led by the German geneticist Peter Gertschen and was part of the South African Defense Forces and also worked in the field of chemical weapons. The German nationality of the geneticist was no random occurrence, as throughout the apartheid era, the regime highly revered so-called German science and did all they could to try to convince German chemists and biologists to move to South Africa and serve the regime. Rudaplat Breeding Enterprise's goal was to create a creature that was a cross between a wolf and a dog, and that had the strength and endurance of a wolf, but also the docility of a German shepherd. Scientists began importing wolves from North America, as South Africa does not have wolves. Once they arrived, they also crossbred them with dogs. The offspring of the two species did prove much more resilient than the dogs, and certainly looked and seemed fierce with yellow eyes and the ability to howl like a wolf, and they also were significantly more muscular, along with lengthier teeth, a harder bite, and increased stamina. However, they were extremely difficult to control. At first, the hybrid dogs would follow directions from the scientists, who they viewed as alpha male wolf pack leaders, but then they would instinctually challenge this leader with force. The hybrid dog's paws were also soft, as its wolf genetics were adapted to snow-covered ground, rather than the rugged and sharp terrain of southern Africa, and therefore they had to wear feet coverings. When the Bush War ended in 1988, the program was discontinued. In general, throughout South Africa's apartheid era, numerous white dog breeders bred a host of ferocious dogs, as there was an enormous demand by the regime and its supporters for dogs hardwired to be vicious and trained to target people by race. One dog breed consisted of a cross between a Rottweiler, Doberman, and a Bloodhound. Another notoriously vicious dog breed, called a Boer Bull, was also created, and whose existence to this day is banned in numerous countries throughout the world. During the same time frame of the 1980s, the increasingly paranoid and desperate apartheid regime also aggressively pursued research into chemical and biological weapons. These pursuits had their origin in 1975, when the South African Defense Force was involved in armed conflict with Angola. The South African military suspected that Angola and other countries near it had chemical and biological weapons, which prompted South Africa to create its own program, with the initial goal of developing defensive measures. By the 1980s, the program began to prioritize developing offensive chemical and biological warfare capabilities. In 1983, a top-secret offensive program was started called Project Coast, which was helmed by former cardiologist Walter Bassan. Maintaining a shroud of secrecy were several front companies that were established by Project Coast, which were designed to hide the purchasing and receiving of components related to chemical and biological weapons manufacturing. The weapons developed were designed to be used by the military as a last resort measure. Additionally, everyday objects were turned into assassination weapons that had the ability to poison targets. These ranged from umbrellas and walking sticks that shot out darts holding poison, syringes made to look like screwdrivers and beer cans and envelopes, and even t-shirts laced with poison. The primary goal of the poisons was to conceal the nature of a cause of death during an autopsy. Between 1977 and 1993, many political opponents of the regime were poisoned in various ways. These political opponents ranged from African National Congress activists, both within and outside the borders of South Africa, as well as police and military personnel who were perceived as too sympathetic to black South African political causes. Additionally, journalists were also poisoned. Project Coast investigated all of the usual avenues of research that other countries with similar programs explored. However, what made the apartheid regime's program disturbingly unique was its focus on inventing non-lethal agents to control and oppress people, rather than to kill them. The program investigated whether widely illegal drugs, as well as legitimate prescription medications, could be turned into potent incapacitating agents. Eventually, an agent from a mixture of these types of drugs was created that could be sprayed over large crowds of rioting people to render them immobile. Additionally, other crowd control agents that were pursued were ones that caused severe blistering on the skin, as well as another that would cause mass sterilization. Cannabis and other drugs were used by some members of the black South African community, and therefore Project Coast sought to create drugs that could be laced with poison. Alternatively, the organization also sought to introduce new drugs and more of the existing drugs into communities that supported the ANC that were not laced with any poison. The exact intention of releasing non-lethal drugs into the black population is not known for sure, but post-apartheid era investigators have theorized that Project Coast either wanted to weaken communities supporting the ANC, or alternatively, they may have just wanted to generate revenue for their own personal gain, or to further fund their research activities. The apartheid regime also sought to secretly control the population of black South Africans by attempting to develop a fake vaccine that could be injected into people to make them sterile without them knowing. Additionally, Project Coast personnel also researched ways to put sterility-inducing substances into water supplies. Monstrously, these population control experiments made up a large percentage of the research activity done under Project Coast, which, if implemented, could under international law be considered an act of genocide. Most notoriously was Project Coast's efforts to create a biological weapon that when used would only harm black South Africans. Nicknamed the Black Bomb by Walter Bassan, it was his hope that the device or substance would be able to attack people based solely on their genetics. Most of these bizarre and twisted projects came to an abrupt end when P.W. Botha, the leader of South Africa throughout most of the 1980s, was replaced by F.W. de Klerk, who knew it was time for the apartheid government to dial its racist policies back. In 1990, Walter Bassan met with de Klerk to discuss the status of Project Coast, and insisted to him that the primary mission of the organization was to develop non-lethal weapons which were allowed by international law. De Klerk agreed to maintain funding for Project Coast, but ordered them to cease their research into lethal agents. In 1993, Bassan, along with 23 other military officers, were ordered to retire, and Project Coast was dissolved, with their final task being to destroy all stocks of chemical and biological weapons. All data related to Project Coast was to be saved on compact discs, and hard copies were to be destroyed. However, evidence that this order was carried out has never come forth, as investigators never received proof that the chemical and biological agents and documents were destroyed. As for the man who orchestrated Project Coast, Walter Bassan, he continued to engage himself in shadow nefarious activities for the rest of the 1990s, including a possible visit to Libya for the purposes of selling them chemical and biological weapons. By the end of the decade, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was established by the Nelson Mandela government to investigate abuses during the apartheid era, caught up to Bassan and brought him to court to answer for his crimes. However, the court acquitted him of all 67 charges in 2002. As of now, he is currently a practicing doctor near Cape Town, South Africa, which when made public, caused an uproar in South African society. MediClinic International, the private hospital group which employs him, said that they cannot prevent someone from practicing medicine unless they are prevented by law from doing so. Not only did the apartheid government oppress and brutalize black South Africans, but it also had a medical torture program that targeted its own white soldiers and its own army. This was carried out in a calculated and institutionalized way through a top-secret policy that is now referred to today as the Aversion Project. The program was run by Dr. Aubrey Levin, whose goal was to eliminate homosexuality in the South African Defense Forces. For an almost two-decade period during the 1980s and 1990s, the Aversion Project identified homosexual soldiers and conscripts in the South African Defense Forces and forced them to undergo painful medical torture for the purposes of supposedly curing them of their homosexuality. Using a twisted logic, the apartheid regime did not allow permanent members of the armed forces to be homosexual, while conscripts were allowed to be homosexual. The only reason conscripts were allowed to be homosexual is because the government feared that if homosexuality were banned completely, then young and white South African men would pretend to be homosexual in order to avoid mandatory military service. If a member of the armed forces were suspected of actual homosexuality, they were sent to a military psychiatric unit and forced to undergo a torturous therapy, whereby they would be subjected to electrical shocks and chemical castration. Additionally, many were given psychiatric drugs and more pseudo-scientific attempts to cure them of their homosexuality. Unsurprisingly, all these so-called treatments failed, but the personnel implementing them may have claimed to have cured a certain amount of soldiers in order to justify maintaining the policy. Unfortunately, failure to cure a victim may sometimes have eventually prompted the perpetrators to force the soldiers to undergo sex changes at military hospitals. Between 1969 and 1987, around 900 men and women were forced to undergo sex changes. Afterwards, they were given new identity papers, discharged from the military, and told to never speak again to friends and family. Gruesomely, many victims died during surgery or were discharged before the surgery was even complete. The military made no effort to follow up on the medical status of the victims, or to pay for any further medical procedures and hormone regimens that would have been required in normal circumstances. The rationale for such medical torture was that gender-reassigned homosexuals, both male and female, would now be supposedly cured of their attraction to the same sex after they had become the opposite sex. Dr. Aubrey Levin not only had a fixation upon homosexuality, but also illegal drug use among whites, and specifically among those in the military. Soldiers suspected of use or having admitted to use were often sent to psychiatric wards run by the military, such as one military in Pretoria. Once there, victims would be forced to take psychiatric drugs and would be subjected to electroshock therapy. In his twisted mind, Dr. Levin believed that any white person who did not fit into the accepted box required of the ruling regime could be fixed or cured with psychiatry. Such a mindset amounted to gross abuses in psychiatry that have corrupted the practice in South Africa to the present day. Those who could not be cured were sent to the north of the country to Grieswald, which is a camp where the victims performed hard labor, all the while being brutalized all the time by the camp's personnel. Psychiatrists in South Africa supported these measures and called for homosexuals to be classified as mentally ill. Once a member of the armed forces was identified as homosexual, they would never be able to attain leadership positions, nor were they trusted with secret information. Oddly, the implementation of the Aversion Project was inconsistent, as there were openly homosexual personnel who were not prosecuted, and there was even an exclusively homosexual-only unit from Uppington that was regarded as somewhat elite. Dr. Aubrey Levin, the mastermind of the Aversion Project, fled to Canada as soon as apartheid ended, and soon began practicing psychiatry in Calgary, Canada. On January 2013, Dr. Levin was found guilty of sexually assaulting several of his psychiatric patients in Canada and given a 5-year prison sentence, of which he only served a portion of due to being paroled in 2016, despite showing no remorse for his crimes. Despite restrictions on the export of armaments and computers to South Africa imposed upon the regime by the outside world, computer equipment coming primarily from American companies like IBM still managed to get through. The apartheid regime, seeking to make their oppression high-tech, sought out companies like IBM, who were all too willing to profit off of the regime, going so far as to customize products specifically for the regime. IBM actively hid these business activities from the United States government, and therefore bypassed laws that had been put in place to sanction the apartheid regime. The regime took full advantage of this cutting-edge computer technology to tighten the reins of control upon the population, and especially the black population. Computers were so essential to the functioning of the regime that by 1977, only the United States and the UK spent more on computers than South Africa, and 41% of all computers ever sold in the country were purchased for government use. The most nefarious application of computer technology in South Africa was its use in managing the population register of the country. In particular, the hated passbook system designed to restrict and monitor the movement of those the government had defined as black within the country was maintained electronically. The latest computer technology streamlined the labor system of the regime by managing the portion of the black population that was to be used in labor operations, while restricting the movement of others who were not needed to the so-called homelands. When a black person in South Africa reached the age of 16, they were issued a passbook, and thus became instantly identifiable to the regime, as it allowed them to use a computer database to look up the person's racial classification and their history of opposition to the government. In the 1980s, South African government authorities even applied city planning software intended for harmless positive uses to help them design black townships that were more easily accessible by police. IBM has been no stranger to controversy, as during the 1930s and 1940s, the companies did business extensively with Nazi Germany. Even after such business dealings were made illegal after the start of World War II, IBM still managed to do business with the regime. In fact, there are numerous disturbing parallels between the IBM's business dealings with Nazi Germany and apartheid South Africa, as the Nazi regime also computerized their tools of oppression, persecution, and eventually the genocide of Jewish people and others considered undesirable by the regime. IBM punch card computers were used by the Nazi German regime extensively to help them identify people to be persecuted, just as the apartheid regime used later IBM computer technology to run their hated passbook system. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed my documentary, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/World Chronicles.